So we've already learned a little bit about keyframing in Fusion earlier on in this module, but let's take this time to dive even deeper into keyframing in Fusion and get a better understanding of how it works. So why don't we add some kind of adjustment node to this clip? So for fun, let's add a color correction node here. We'll add it in the chain of commands. And let's open up the inspector and make some modifications in this color corrector node. So why don't we make this a bit greener? But first, why don't we go to the beginning here? Let's set a keyframe for the color wheel over here. So if we set a keyframe, it's going to record that value at that time. And let's go later on in here and let's make things very green. Why not? And we can see that it's added that keyframe over here. So now if we scrub through here, we can see things go from blue to very green. Now, keyframing the color grade is something that I do a lot in a lot of my more advanced transitions to help flow from one environment to another. You want to keyframe the colors of one environment to kind of change to match the next one, because if you get the colors to match up, it feels a bit more realistic. So that's something that I do all the time. Now, one thing I want you to notice is we can see on this node, there is a little keyframe over here. This is very important because now when we're looking at our node tree, not only can we tell that there's this color corrector node inside of this chain of commands, but we've also keyframed some of the properties within this color corrector node. So just by looking at our node tree, we can see that there is some keyframing going on in this node. This is very important. Now, another thing I want you to notice is when I deselect this node, watch what happens with the keyframe over here in our main timeline. If I click out of the node, those disappear. So if I have my original media in node selected, I don't see any keyframes on this timeline here. But if I have the color corrector node selected, all of a sudden we can see that keyframe over there. So that's really good to know. Not only can you get a visual representation that this node is being keyframed by having this little node icon here, we can also just select the node and we can see where the keyframes are on the timeline over here. So that's very helpful as well. And of course, just like we learned before, we can open up the keyframes window here. And if I just open this up, let's close the inspector, we can see where those keyframes sit in line with everything else here in the keyframes window. Now, right now we can't see them. Let's click this color corrector over here, and let's click this zoom to fit button over here. But if we take a look at these lines within the keyframes window here, we can see that tint angle and tint length are keyframed over time. So they're going from a value of 0 or a different value. They're going from one value here to another value, and we can see that change in between both of these keyframes. Now, obviously they're very small. So what we're going to want to do is just zoom in so we can actually hold command and scroll in within the keyframes window to get a better look at those keyframes. Now in here, I can move keyframes around pretty easily. So if I select one of these keyframes, I can move it so it happens faster. So let's just take a look at what that does. So we're just changing the tint angle. We're making that go faster. So I actually don't even know what this would do, but this is the process of experimentation, just playing around with things and seeing how they affect your image. And we can also move the tilt length, and we can see how that would affect our final image here. And we can select both of these keyframes if we want to and move them both at once as well. So all we're really doing here is just moving the keyframes in time. We're moving them around in the timeline freely here to whatever position we want. We can also select everything and just move the whole keyframe range over. So the keyframes window is great for moving your keyframes around in time, but what if you wanted to change the way that the animation is happening from one keyframe to another? Well, that's where the spline window comes into play. So if we open up the spline window, let's just move this over here. We can see that we also have color corrector available here, and we can just enable color corrector at the top, and we can see which of these parameters are the ones that are being changed. So we can see that we have tint angle and we have tint length, this set of keyframes right here. So this is that new keyframe that we just created, the one that we duplicated. We don't need that, so I'm just gonna select it and hit delete. Now we're not just seeing both of these parameters, we're also seeing all the other parameters that the color corrector allows us to change in here as well. So what we could do is actually just uncheck color corrector, hit that button twice, and we can select tint angle and tint length. those are the parameters that we want to focus on. Now, the spline window is great because it allows us to really focus on how we want to animate between these values here. Because the spline window is really just a graph that shows you value over time. So it's time and value. So if I zoom in here, I can hold the middle mouse button as well to move around both of these areas. That's a good shortcut to know. I can see that things are moving very linear right now. So things are going straight right. So our value here, it stays the same. It's at 0. And then once it hits this point, it starts to move up in a very linear way. So the way that our values are being changed here is very linear. We can see it's going from 0 directly into a very fast change over here. So we're not making any gradual changes here. Things are very abrupt. We're going from 0, immediately shooting up all the way to this value and then stopping right away. If this was a smooth transition, we would have more of like a curve here, but right now it's just an abrupt stop. So what the spline window allows us to do is to modify those keyframes. So if I select one of these keyframes, we can see that something happened. We have this little handle that's attached to this keyframe. It pops up. So if I click on that handle, I can now move the way that the line is being animated at that keyframe point over there. So now we can see that we're not going immediately from one value to another. We're gradually getting there. We're making that change gradually. So in this case, we're going from 0, it's abrupt here, and then we're going to gradually go into our next value of 0.35. Now, an important thing to understand about the spline window here is that this is a chart that's showing us the value of the selected property here over time, right? So we could see that the value of both our tint angle and tint length within the color corrector are at 0 over here. And over here, they end at 0.35 and 0.25. So 2 different values. And what we can do is actually select any of these keyframes and make a value change here if we wanted to. So by moving this keyframe up and down, I'm actually changing the value of that property at this point in time. So before, the tint length was about 0.35. I can bump it up all the way to 0.6. I can very quickly make that change right in here in the spline window. Same thing with tint angle. I can make these changes right in here. Now you can see when I'm moving the value up and down, it can be hard to stay exactly locked in one place without moving right and left. What I'm doing by moving right and left is actually I'm changing the timing of the value. So over here we can see that the value at frame 3190 is going to be around 0.45. Well, if I want that value of 0.45 to be later on, maybe frame 3200, I can just move it over there. So that's really what I'm doing. I'm just moving the keyframes in time, but I can also affect the value of each keyframe as well within this graph. So it could be a very quick and easy way to make those keyframe modifications. Now, if we take a look at the way that we're animating from one value to another, things are very linear right now. And if you take a look at this, the way that things look when they're linear like this in a graph does not look good. Let me just preview this for you guys so you can see what things look like. Okay, so actually watching this back, I don't think that an animated color change is the best way to show you the difference between a smooth and a more abrupt transition. So let's just delete this color correction node and let's actually add a transform node. So let's animate the scale of the clip over time. So let's go to the beginning of our clip here. Let's make the size a value of 1, and then further down the timeline, let's zoom in a lot more. Cool. So let's close the inspector. We can see in the keyframes window that both of those keyframes have been created right there. And obviously we are seeing the full length of the clip. So those keyframes look like they're very close together. And of course, within our timeline up here, we can see those 2 keyframes right there. So let's go into our spline window. Let's actually just close keyframes. We don't need to see that right now. And let's zoom in so we can fit this to the size of the spline window. And now let's watch this. Let's see how this animation unfolds. So I'll go to the beginning. Let's press play. Awesome. I'm actually going to make this second keyframe happen a bit earlier just by dragging it like this. And if I hold shift, it'll let me drag this keyframe left and right without having to worry about changing the value of the keyframe. Same thing goes for the value as well. If I hold shift and start dragging it up and down, I could change the value without worrying about moving it left and right. So shift is going to be your best friend when you're making these kind of changes within the spline graph over here. So I've moved these keyframes closer together. Now let's go back to the beginning and preview this. We can see it's very abrupt. It doesn't look professional. It doesn't look good. So I'll rarely have my keyframes like this. Usually, most of the time, I will smooth them out. And the easiest way to do this is to just select both of these keyframes, and you can select F on your keyboard, and it'll smoothen out the in and out points of both of those keyframes. So now if we watch this, we can see things look a lot smoother and looks a lot more professional, a lot better. Now F is just a quick shortcut to change the keyframe animation on the selected keyframes. I'm gonna hit Command Z to undo that, and I'm just gonna select one of these keyframes. We can see once I've selected a keyframe, it's given us a handle over here. So if I take this other square that came up here and I move it around, I'm able to animate the animation path between both of these keyframes just like that by using this handle. So I can replicate what we just did by pressing F by grabbing both of these handles and aligning them just like this to the grid. And now we've manually replicated what we did when we pressed F over here. So here we can see that the change in value is a lot more gradual. It's not abrupt like it was before. Linear is abrupt. We want things to be smooth like this. So now the value is staying at 1, and it continues to stay at 1 even past the keyframe point, but then it starts to accelerate slowly, and then it gets into this consistent speed here, and then it starts to slowly slow down into its final value over here. So this is something you'll find yourself doing a lot in the spline graph, is just smoothing things out to make them feel less abrupt. Now, of course, we can do the complete opposite. So if we did this, so in this situation, what we're doing is a very abrupt change, pretty much the opposite of what we just did previously. So let's preview this. So as we can see, it looks like something's off with it. It just doesn't look good. So you wouldn't necessarily be doing this, but what's important to understand is the spline window is really just a playground for you to experiment and play around with these handles and with keyframes to do whatever you want. And if at any point you want to add another keyframe here, you can simply just hover your mouse anywhere over the line and you can add a keyframe just like that. And now we also have some shortcuts down here in the bottom left. So if we have one of our keyframes selected, we can use these shortcuts to make things linear or smooth them out just like that. And we also have some other shortcuts here that aren't accessible to us right now because we only have one keyframe selected. So if we select multiple keyframes like these 3 over here, we can see that all of these options are now available to us. I'm not going to dive too deep into these right now, but basically these just allow you to apply presets to a selection of keyframes. So if I press step in, we can see that now what it's done is it's made this kind of step animation. So it's basically going to continue with this value past the keyframe and then automatically right away jump to another value and then stay at that value, jump again. So this is very jumpy. Let's see what it looks like. So that could be good in certain scenarios. You might actually want to use that. We have the opposite of that one. We have, instead of step, it is, what is it here? Step out. We have step in and step out. So that does the opposite. And then we have other options here afterwards as well. I haven't really found in my own workflow that I've needed to use these shortcuts, but they are there if you need them. And in certain situations, I can see how they would definitely be useful. Awesome. So we're a little bit better at using keyframes within Fusion now. I highly recommend that you guys open up Fusion, try this out yourselves, just experiment. It doesn't matter if what you're doing makes sense or not. Just get familiar with how to put keyframes down and how to use them within the interface. So then that way, when the time comes for you to actually execute one of your visions within DaVinci, you'll know exactly what you're doing. But that's it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. I'll catch you in the next one.